Welcome back. It's time now for the France 24 debate. Today, we're trying to make sense of what's happening in Tehran, where the Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Zarif announced his resignation on Monday evening. It was an announcement that appeared to come as a complete surprise right across the board. Well, in his unexpected message, 59-year-old Zarif, who's been in that post for nearly 6 years, offered an apology for what he called his shortcomings in his capacity as the Islamic Republic's top diplomat. Well, the US-educated minister became a familiar face on the international stage during the build-up to the 2015 nuclear deal. Well, reactions to that news have come from across the globe. Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of arch-foe Israel, tweeted, "Zarif is gone. Good riddance." Meanwhile, the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo shrugged off this news, saying it makes no difference to Washington whether Zarif stays or goes. He said, quote, "Either way, he and Hassan Rouhani are just front men for a corrupt religious mafia." Or back home in Iran, where as recently as December, hardliners were trying to get Zarif impeached, more moderate reformist figures urged the president not to accept this resignation. So why did Zarif resign? And where does this leave the Iran nuclear deal? And what does this tell us about the state of affairs in Iran? Well, those are just some of the questions I'll be putting to our panel today. But first of all, let's get reaction to this news from Tehran, where France 24's Reza Sayah is standing by for us. Reza, where are we now with this resignation? Has it been accepted or not?
It has not at this hour. It has been a strange 24 hours, obviously, with lots of strange developments. But again, the headline at this hour is that Mohammad Zarif is still Iran's foreign minister. Within the past several hours, two state-run media outlets citing Iran's foreign ministry spokesman in reporting that Iran's President Hassan Rouhani has not accepted Mr. Zarif's resignation. The foreign ministry spokesman's also saying that all speculation, all explanations that were reported as to why Mr. Zarif posted that resignation message on his Instagram are unfounded and false. So from all of this, we can glean this, that again, Mr. Zarif is still the foreign ministry, but that also something happened that didn't please Mr. Zarif, that compelled him suddenly to post that Instagram message. Here's what we do not know. We still don't know if beyond that Instagram message, Mr. Zarif also submitted an actual formal official resignation to Mr. Rouhani. And that said, we don't know if Mr. Rouhani rejected the resignation formally or if he informally responded to an informal Instagram message. But again, bottom line, Mr. Zarif still the foreign minister. All his supporters who were very upset are breathing a sigh of relief, and all his detractors who were celebrating are putting their party on hold for now.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you, whether you got the impression that this was a long time in the coming. Was this a resignation entirely of Zarif's own accord, or was he pushed into it? What are your thoughts, Reza?
It's really hard to say because we haven't heard directly from Mr. Zarif. But here's what this development indicates. It indicates something that many careful and knowledgeable observers of Iranian politics already know, that Iran has various factions, moderates, reformists, fundamentalists, hardliners, and these factions do not get along. There's a power struggle, a tug of war to craft a policy. There's been a lot of pressure on Mr. Zarif. Late last year, they tried to impeach him. This development perhaps is an indication that tension, that conflict is intensifying, or things could go a different way. Because of the support Mr. Zarif received over the past 24 hours from the president, and especially if he received support from the supreme leader, that could cause the hardliners to back off their pressure. But certainly at a time when Iran has a lot of problems, a lot of economic problems, all these factions must mend their problems because they have a lot of work to do.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for helping us to make sense of that. France 24's Reza Sayah in Tehran, thank you so much. Well, let's meet our panel. Today, I'm joined here in the studio by Thierry Coville, who is a research fellow at the French Centre for International and Strategic Studies, and also the author of Iran, the Invisible Revolution. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Thierry. From London, we're joined by Tara Kangarlou, who is a journalist and a fellow at the East-West Institute. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. From Washington, we're joined by Ali Vaez, the Iran project director at the Crisis Group. Thank you very much indeed. You often write about international affairs and Iranian affairs in particular, so we look forward to speaking to you. And from Tehran, we're joined by Mohammad Marandi, who is a political analyst at Tehran University. Let me go straight to you in Tehran, Professor, because I mean, the question that we're asking ourselves over here is this chaos, or are we looking at some very carefully thought out tactics here?
Well, it is politics, and I think that it is something quite normal. In Western countries, it would be considered to be the normal state of affairs, checks and balances. But when it comes to Iran, I think it's because since there's a sort of stereotype about Iran, it's called the power struggle. I think that it is normal that you have different political parties, different political factions with there are no two or three, there are quite a few, and they have different beliefs and different agendas, and they're pursuing different policies, and they are interacting with one another. And I think today was one side of that. You see a lot of conflict going on in the media between different political parties. But I think what really happened was that President Dr. Zarif was upset that he was not invited to a meeting with the Syrian president. The reason I think that the president, part of the problem was that the president was brought in secretly for security reasons, but he believed that that was not enough, that he should have been invited to the meeting, which I think is a justified argument. It's upset with the president.
Okay.
But I think there are also issues, and it's the issue of the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, and other issues that are the FATF debate that's going on in Iran. And I think that Western European countries have to recognize that if they do not, if they continue to abide by demands made by Trump and refuse to abide by their side of the bargain in the nuclear deal, they are discrediting those who are looking for an opportunity to increase relations with Western countries. So I think Europe has to make a decision. Either they stand up to Trump and abide by the agreement, or they just basically give up and say that we're going to follow Trump, even though they've signed on to this agreement. They're making it very hard for Dr. Zarif to justify the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, when Iran is the only side that's abiding by it and the Europeans are not.
Okay, Professor, thanks for sharing that. So let's go to Ali Vaez, because I'd like to put some of what the professor said to you, because I gather you met with Mohammad Javad Zarif at the Munich Security Conference just last week. I mean, did you get any indication when you were talking to him that this resignation could be on the cards? Or do you think it is, as Professor Marandi was just saying, the result of a tantrum, anger at not being included at those talks between President Hassan Rouhani and President Bashar al-Assad of Syria?
Look, I think the Syria meeting snub was probably just a catalyst, not the cause. The cause has been a tremendous amount of domestic pressure that has been building up on the Rouhani administration generally, and especially on Foreign Minister Zarif. Obviously, the fact that his key achievement, which was the JCPOA, is now in dire straits, has discredited him internally. And the very fact that he also failed to push through the legislation that the parliament had agreed to vote on financial action task force requirements that would bring Iran's banking standards to the international level, but was stuck in the Expediency Council as a result of opposition by hardliners within the system, I think demonstrated that he is now in a very difficult situation in pushing his agenda, both because of domestic pressures and also because of the Europeans' inability to really deliver much their promises on preserving the JCPOA's economic dividends for Iran. So I think he was probably looking for a pretext to get out of this difficult situation, and the snub that happened around the Syria meeting provided him with that pretext.
Okay, let's go to London and speak to Tara Kangarlou. I mean, do you get the impression that perhaps there's some strategy here on the part of Mr. Zarif in that he's announcing his resignation with the hope that moderate forces will get together and beg him to stay and therefore make his job of foreign minister easy? Or does that all sound rather far-fetched to you?
I think the foreign minister's job will not necessarily get easier if the moderates come together. So I think what we need to be careful at looking at is if the supreme leader, who's of course supported by hardliners and conservatives, come around and say, we don't want you to resign. I think that's more powerful than moderates coming together, because we already know that the Rouhani administration supports Dr. Zarif. We already know that the majority of everyday Iranians, the Iranian society that is a reformist and moderate society, supports Foreign Minister Zarif. So what he needs is the counterpart, the hardliners, to take a back seat and let him do the job. And that will only come if the supreme leader publicly denounces his resignation and asks him to stay. So that's something that would be very interesting to see.
Okay, Thierry, Coville, you've been sitting patiently here. Just listening to what Tara Kangarlou was saying there. I mean, is what Zarif doing essentially calling on the Ayatollah to pick sides? Whose side is he on? Is he with the moderates or is he with the hardliners? Because he can't have both.
You mean Khamenei?
Yes.
Nobody knows. I mean, what you have to understand in the Iranian political system is that's true. They have different political forces. That's why by the way, the US reaction is so stupid, because they are fighting with each other. We have the proof. But let's say the supreme leader has the role to realize a kind of synthesis of all these groups. So he's an hardliner, but he's trying to get a synthesis and to look what is, we can talk about that, what is in the interest of the country. They say, Iranians say manofe meli, or the interest of the regime of the country. So he's trying to take really what he should do with that. What is interesting, what is going on in Iran is, let's say, the main issue is Iran is, as it has been said, is staying in the deal, nuclear deal, at their cost, and they are suffering a lot from the economic crisis. And they have the feeling that is true, the Europeans are not doing everything they could do. On the other hand, the hardliners are not able to say what we could do if we were, directing the country. And let's say, I would say that Khamenei knows that. He knows that it's easy to criticize, Rouhani's government on, still keeping on the JCPOA. On the other hand, going out of the JCPOA is a big risk. So we see all these tensions, and that's why I think there is so many uncertainties, because it's not so easy to find someone else like Zarif. It's not so easy to have an alternative policy. So that's why, not talking about individuals, what we see in Iran, there are a lot of critics against Rouhani's government. But what Zarif has said, he said, okay, I'm going out, what do you do? And we see that, it's like in other countries, it's very easy to criticize. It's quite difficult to have an alternative policy to what is going on in Iran.
Okay, now everyone's had a chance to put their position on the table. Feel free from this point onwards to jump in and contradict and disagree if that is indeed what you feel. But let me just, in the meantime, go back to Tehran University and speak to Mohammad Marandi, because I want to know how all of this is being viewed by the Iranian public, because they're watching this rather confusing state of affairs. And I'm wondering, where does public sentiment lie? Are they on the side of Zarif? Are they alarmed by the prospect of the departure of their foreign minister?
Well, it's difficult to say. According to polls, Dr. Zarif is one of the two most popular figures in Iran. The first is the General Soleimani, the commander of the Quds forces that fought in Iraq and Syria against ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And following him, Dr. Zarif is the second most important or second most popular politician. So these are sort of seen as the two wings of Iranian foreign policy. He is a popular figure, and he's not affiliated to any political party. At one time, a couple of decades ago, the reformists were actually his antagonists, and now some of the conservatives are, although I wouldn't say all of them by any means. As I said earlier, and as I think a couple of your other guests alluded to, Iranian politics is not two political parties. There are different political parties, different factions. It's very fluid politics in Tehran. But I think, again, I don't think that Dr. Zarif resigned in order to get anyone's support. He's not that sort of person. He was angry. I think that it was the result of the snub, as one of your guests said. But I think, as your guest also pointed out, there were issues that accumulated over the last few months that made it difficult for him to continue. And I would again stress that I think the main problem is that Europe, more than anyone else, is responsible. We see in Tehran, again, according to polls, the University of Maryland polls, for example, support for the JCPOA, or the nuclear deal, is on the decline in Iran. And the reason is because Iranians are seeing, it's still like 50% or 51% who support it, but there is a decline. And the reason is because Iranians are seeing that the Iranian government has been abiding in full by its commitments. Just a couple of days ago, the International Atomic Energy Agency once again said that Iran is in full compliance. Yet the United States has torn the agreement, and the Europeans, which are also a part of the agreement, they're not abiding by it. They are in violation because they're being intimidated by Trump. The Europeans are afraid to support their citizens, their companies, and therefore they're effectively, whether they are happy about it or not, they are abiding by Trump's demands and policies. So increasingly people in Iran are saying, or many people, I can't say the majority or the minority, I don't know, but increasingly some people are saying, well, we should be more aggressive or robust in our policies to put pressure on the Europeans to start abiding by their side of the bargain. So I personally think that even though the United States has torn the agreement, Iran has, in the international community, taken the upper ground, because they've shown that we are the side that wants peace, we are the side that wants stability. But at the same time, people are saying that we cannot continue forever just abiding by the agreement and allowing the Americans to make Iranians suffer, just to make the international community see that we are sort of like we're the good guys and Trump is the bad guy. That's not enough for most people.
Let me go back to Ali Vaez, because it sounds like you're on the same page as Mohammad Marandi in saying that the non-meeting with Bashar al-Assad was the final straw, causing Zarif to snap and announce his resignation. But it is a pretty thankless task looking at it from the outside. I mean, what's your verdict on what kind of a foreign minister Zarif has been from the point of view of Iran and from the point of view of the international community? What's your verdict on his performance?
Look, without any doubt, he's one of the most effective diplomats that Iran has ever had, not just under the Islamic Republic. There are former foreign ministers under the Shah who have come out praising Zarif's diplomatic skills. But I think, without any doubt, the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA has put him and the Rouhani administration in a very difficult situation. The question now is, because of the public nature of Dr. Zarif's announcement, if he is to go back to his position, he has to do so with renewed authority that, as Tara said, would not come without the Supreme Leader's direct intervention. But the Supreme Leader's intervention will also potentially have some political consequences, which one has to take into account.
I'm going to have to cut you short there, Ali Vaez, because we're coming up to the end of part one. Stay tuned. I'll be back in just a couple of minutes with the rest of the debate. Welcome back to the France 24 debate. Today we're examining the reaction to the news of the surprise resignation of the Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif, a man who's held the post of the Islamic Republic's top diplomat for some 6 years. Well, before I go back to our panel, here's France 24's Catherine Viette with a profile piece on the Iranian Foreign Minister.
A shock resignation delivered in an unconventional manner. Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif used his Instagram account to say he's stepping down. Posting his words over an image of a white-robed figure, Zarif gave both his regrets and his thanks. He said he apologized for his inability to continue serving and for all the shortcomings during his term in office. Zarif spent a large portion of his life in the United States, first for his studies at university, then as a diplomat at the United Nations, where he served as the Iranian ambassador from 2002 to 2007. 6 years later, Zarif was appointed foreign minister during President Hassan Rouhani's first term in office. Considered a moderate, Zarif seen by many as the architect of the landmark 2015 nuclear deal between Iran and major international powers. While Zarif enjoyed support at home, he was not popular with hardliners in the government. And since President Donald Trump pulled the U.S. out of the nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions, criticism against him has mounted. It's now up to President Rouhani and Iran's supreme leader to accept Zarif's resignation.
Okay, a look at the career of Mohammad Javad Zarif. Let's go to London and speak now to Tara Kangarlou, a journalist and a fellow at the East-West Institute who's standing by for us. Just in terms of reaction to the resignation of Mohammad Javad Zarif, Washington sounded indifferent. That seemed to be the message from Mike Pompeo in his tweet. But do you think that indifference is genuine? Because, I mean, surely in Washington, they must be aware of some of the possible alternatives to Mohammad Javad Zarif.
Of course, I think you can very clearly see the people who are pleased and happy with this. And even though their tone was not as vibrant as some people would have expected, it was clearly an indication that any turmoil and turbulence in the domestic political climate in Iran is welcomed by especially the Trump administration, Secretary of State Pompeo, because of their agenda and aim, and that is to, as they say, cause some sort of regime change and the agenda of confrontation that they want to push. We immediately heard from the Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu, and it's to their benefit. It's to the benefit of their agenda if you get, instead of Foreign Minister Zarif, a hardliner who supports the Iranian regime's narratives of isolation, and that would only feed to what Israel, folks in Saudi Arabia, and the current administration in the U.S. want, and that is a more aggressive, confrontational, and tense relation with Iran. They cannot justify that approach and that behavior under a diplomat like Zarif. And, that can be an end game if tomorrow or whenever we truly see Zarif gone and instead of him, a hardliner replaced by the current regime.
Yeah, let me ask you, Thierry, do you agree that the departure of Dr. Zarif would basically first slam the door on a dialogue, possibly with the West? I'm talking about constructive dialogue. And does it play into the hands of those in parts of the world that would perhaps like to see things go up a peg or two in terms of the escalation between Tehran and other world powers?
On one hand, yes, and I don't think we should personalize too much Iranian politics. I think it's more a question of positions, strategic issues, what is the interest of the country, what should do. So again, I'm reading, but it's important. I think if you look at, the supreme leader, I don't know nobody knows what he thinks, but, the official Iranian position would be, yes, we are suffering economically. Yes, people are not happy with the result of the nuclear agreement. Yet, it is better for Iran until now to stay in the deal. So let's take the hypothesis that they take someone else. I think the strategy will be the same. On the other hand, as it was said, there is the feeling in Iran that we have been, let's say, too nice or too naive. So maybe you will have someone that will be still a diplomat saying we stay in the deal. But on the other hand, not being so, smiling, let's say, or so comprehensive of European, difficulties and so on. So I think that's the main point. I just wanted to just add, say, I completely agree on the US, let's say, being happy in the sense that, having a more isolationist Iran and a more aggressive Iran. But you can see, I would say the word in English, it's irresponsible policy. I was thinking of, this Munich conference with Vice President Mike Pence is inviting the Europeans to go out of the nuclear deal. So we have the Korean policy of saying, and so what will go on? So we see this, this completely irresponsible policy of pushing an aggressive Iran, as if it was the same to deal with Rouhani or with Ahmadinejad. What at least you can criticize Europe, and I would agree on the fact that Europe is not doing enough. But the problem with Europe is the companies. Companies are afraid of your sanctions. It's difficult to give them guarantees. On the other hand, Europe knows that Europe is staying in the deal, and you can thank them that they stay in the deal. And there is a big disagreement, big tension. You see what happened in the Warsaw Conference, in the Munich Conference. You cannot say, as I heard from Tehran, that Europeans are following blindly Trump. There is a big, it's a big gap between European policy and Iran. They want to stay in the deal. I agree that they have not found the right way to counteract the US sanctions. But you can say on the political, they don't want a more isolationist Iran on the European side.
Let me put this to Ali Vaez. I mean, we've just been saying, Dr. Zarif is an affable, friendly man, a smiley man. We've all got to know him, it would appear. It feels like that anyway. We've seen him on our TV screens for these last 6 years. And, he's a friendly face of the regime. And I'm just wondering, are there any thoughts in your mind as to who might be in the running as a likely replacement? And would the Iranians be thinking along the lines of, let's find someone a bit like Dr. Zarif, because it would be much easier for our foes, shall we say, to demonize us if the face of Iran, diplomatically speaking, is someone demonic?
Look, first of all, let me say that in Iran, foreign policy is made through a consensual decision-making process. So individuals matter, but they're not alone in making decisions. This even applies to the supreme leader himself, who's not a totalitarian leader at all and has to basically function within a very complicated decision-making system. When it gets to diplomacy, obviously personalities matter. And I think if in fact Dr. Zarif's resignation is accepted, which I have serious doubts about, but if it is accepted, then President Rouhani would probably get a chance to appoint someone who is in line with his vision for Iran's foreign policy and would still operate along the lines of the strategy that Iran has devised, which is basically to wait out the Trump administration. And in that case, we might see Foreign Minister's current deputy, Mr. Araghchi, who's been basically the main interlocutor between Iran and the Europeans, replace him. Or it might very well be Rouhani's chief of staff, Mahmoud Vaezi, who has a long hand in foreign policy and is as moderate and open-minded as Foreign Minister Zarif. However, if this is indeed an indication of Rouhani's weakening and turning into a lame duck president, then we might see a hardliner being forced upon him as a foreign minister, which again I think is unlikely, but if it happens, it is a clear indication of a shift in Iranian foreign policy towards the right as the Iranians start to lose hope in the remaining parties to the JCPOA, providing them not just with the economic benefits that the deal promised, but also with the strategic benefits, because remember that the deal was also supposed to desecuritize Iran on the international stage. And the very fact that UK Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt goes to the Warsaw Conference, the very fact that the French Foreign Minister, Mr. Le Drian, constantly complains about Iran's ballistic missile program, while European countries continue to provide Iran's regional rivals with conventional weapons, it is resulting in the school of thought in Iran, who's promoting dialogue and restraint, quickly losing its stock.
Yeah, there's another layer to all of this as well, isn't there? Because in his resignation message, Dr. Zarif seemed to be implying that he didn't want to see a whole spate of resignations. He called on his colleagues not to walk out en masse. And I'm just wondering whether, I put this to all of you. I mean, do you think there is a feeling that there could be a sort of a mass walkout in Tehran from people in positions of power? Because that did seem to be the sort of the undertone of the message that Dr. Zarif put out last night when he resigned. Let me put that to you, since you're here in the studio.
Yeah, I mean, I read in the comments from some Iranian specialists in Tehran. They are talking about the oil minister Zanganeh, saying that he could follow if Marandi. So I'm going to contradict myself a little, saying yes, if all these, let's say, experienced and talented people and who have been, let's say, who have been willing to cooperate with the West on diplomacy, with Western companies like Zanganeh, are leaving, and you have more, even if Iran goes on with this policy of maintaining the deal, we have seen already they might select people who are more forceful, and so more on security matters. So that could be, obviously, if there is someone else than Zarif, and you have several change, and it had already happened. If it seems that the people they have selected, Iran has selected as economic minister, because they have already been changed, have some security backgrounds. So, and I think it's logic. If you look at the position in Iran today, they are talking about the economic war, implemented on them from the US, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. And they know that the ultimate goal is regime change. It's obvious. I mean, I heard, if I'm correct, Robin Hook, the guy in charge of the Iranian policy, talking about what should do the next government in Iran. So officially, they are talking about regime change. So you can understand why in Iran there are some groups who think that, okay, we can, for the moment, go on with this policy of maintaining the deal, but maybe we could have some, let's say, more forceful government and being more concerned by security issues and this issue that to negotiate, you have this line of thinking in Iran that to negotiate with the West, and especially with the US, like the North Koreans, you need to negotiate in position of strength. So you have the thinking in Iran. So yes, if Zarif leaves and other people leaves, you might have this way of thinking winning in Iran, obviously.
Let me put that same point to Tara Kangarlou in London. I mean, do you see a spate of resignations? Do you see a mass walkout that Dr. Zarif implied was a possibility, it would seem?
I think we shouldn't underestimate the reaction from the masses and the general public that would cause, because you have a moderate administration right now. Its top diplomat, a very popular man, and I would beg to differ with your guess that the Iranian public would very much prefer a character like Zarif over a military general like Qasem Soleimani. And I'm talking about everyday Iranians that represent the Iranian society. If you have someone like that exit and following him more diplomats and more politicians belonging to this moderate government exiting, this would cause a huge uproar in the Iranian public. And we have to remember that so many people, millions of Iranians in the second round of elections voted for Rouhani because of Zarif. They wanted Zarif to stay, and they saw him as their key in belonging to the international community, in having a respected face that for the longest time they did not have under President Ahmadinejad and previously. So for the Iranian public, the foreign minister represents something much bigger than the JCPOA or a nuclear accord. Of course, they're not seeing the result that they wanted out of the nuclear deal economically, but the Iranian people and the Iranian public is incredibly terrified of going back to an Ahmadinejad type era. So this would have a huge reaction, I believe, inside Iran and on the ground.
Yeah, and just to stay with us, because I want to ask you this other question as well. I mean, just going back to this announcement message of the resignation, and there's another part to it as well, which was, in this message, Dr. Zarif said, "I apologize for my inability to continue serving and for the shortcomings during my term in office." Now, what are these shortcomings? Are they shortcomings perceived by him, or are they shortcomings perceived perhaps by hardline elements in Iran? Tara, for you first, please.
I mean, as someone who grew up in Iran, there are very equivocal and polite ways that Iranian politicians and diplomats speak. So in a way, he wanted to be humble. He wanted to remain his humility. But then again, the way he phrased it really is speaking, I believe, to hardliners, that I did what I could do, the ball is in your court. And in reality, the ball is really in the court of the hardliners and the diehard supporters of the supreme leaders and those who want the policies of isolation and tension with the West because, of course, of its advantages for them. So I believe that he was both being humble but also very strategic in acknowledging that his policies of reform, dialogue, engagement has not been appetizing for the hardliners, and he's very well aware of that.
Ali, let me just ask you, Ali Vaez in Washington. I mean, what's your understanding of these shortcomings? Would you concur with what Tara just said?
Sure, it's definitely the Persian politeness on display, but I would also add that he has openly admitted that there were some mistakes committed during the nuclear negotiations. Obviously, the very fact that Iran wasn't even benefiting materially from the nuclear deal during the Obama administration, I think put on display the fact that the sanctions relief part of the deal maybe was not as well negotiated as the nuclear concessions that the Iranians made. So there is some truth to that as well. But again, I don't think we should consider this move to have too much to do with domestic politics. There's a lot of speculation that Zarif has done this in order to pave the ground for maybe running as a presidential candidate in 2021. I doubt that's the case. This man is a professional diplomat, is a career diplomat, and has always felt most comfortable in the field of diplomacy rather than Iran's internal politics that he doesn't know too well and has always been a victim of whenever he has said anything related to Iran's domestic politics.
Let's go back to Tehran and speak to Mohammad Marandi at Tehran University. We were just speaking there about these shortcomings that Dr. Zarif mentioned in his resignation message, and he apologized for those shortcomings. And we're just asking, what is everybody's understanding of what he was getting at there? Is this Persian politeness, as we've been saying, or what was the sort of the deeper message behind it, do you think?
So whatever I say is not in response to anyone in particular. I think it is partially sort of, as you call it, a Persian humility or politeness. Partially, I think, obviously, he recognizes that he's not perfect. The nuclear deal, well, he worked very hard to negotiate that deal, and like any deal, there are flaws. But I think his argument would be that he did not expect Trump to become president and to simply tear apart the deal, and for the European countries to be so passive. I mean, vocally they speak against Trump, but they are effectively very passive when responding to Trump on the ground. And so, for example, right now the argument that we have in Iran over the FATF and whether Iran should join the FATF is linked to the nuclear deal, because those who are worried and critical are saying, well, what if we join and the Americans use this to gain access to our finances and use this to make their sanctions more effective? So because of the enormous mistrust against the United States, this is preventing Iran from joining. And the fact that the Europeans are really showing themselves to be ineffective. And when you include what happens, for example, in Venezuela, when the Europeans quickly hop on board, when Trump wants to do something, that makes Iranians even more wary. So I don't think Dr. Zarif, obviously he did not expect Trump to become president, even though Obama really didn't abide by his commitments either. But Trump, he really went and completely wrecked the deal as much as he could. But I would also add that Dr. Zarif, in my opinion, because I do know him, his resignation, I think, was a bit out of anger, because he does get angry at times. But I think it was completely sincere. I do believe that he is the best diplomat that this country has seen in modern history, although I don't deny his shortcomings or anyone's shortcomings. And I'm not completely sure that he is going to be stepping aside. We'll have to wait and see. But if he does stay in power, I believe he was sincere in his resignation, and it will have nothing to do with playing politics. I do not believe for a second that he has any intention to run for presidency in 2 years from now.
Okay, let's go back to Washington, to Ali Vaez, the other person on our panel who has been in recent contact with Dr. Zarif. Would you agree with what was just said there? And do you think that, in fact, Dr. Zarif is in fact going to leave that post, or you ultimately see some sort of an arrangement being made whereby, in fact, he doesn't actually vacate the post?
Yes, I agree. And, I can add that there is precedent for this, that when President Ahmadinejad ascended to power in 2005 and basically fired most of Iran's career diplomats and more moderate forces of Iranian diplomacy, Zarif, too, wanted to leave his post as ambassador to the United Nations. But he was forced to stay on for 2 years and defend policies of President Ahmadinejad, with whom he had very deep disagreements, mostly because the Supreme Leader asked him to stay on. And the reason he was asked to stay on is that he has extraordinary communication skills in order to basically shift the blame to the United States and drive a wedge between the US and its allies, especially the Europeans. And I think the Iranians still are very much in need of Zarif's skills under the current circumstances, where they see themselves as besieged by the US and its regional allies, meaning Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Israel. And in that sense, I think there is definitely a need for the Iranian system to try to keep him. Now, the question is how to do it, and I don't believe a presidential rejection of his resignation would be sufficient, because now that Zarif has gone public with the reason of his resignation, and he has said that he has done this as a way of basically nudging the system out of undermining the Ministry of Foreign Affairs' role in devising Iran's regional policy. I think the corrective measure has to come from higher up, and it has to come from the Supreme Leader. Otherwise, I see it quite difficult for Zarif to be able to go back to his position and restore his authority.
Thierry, you wanted to jump in?
At least talking from the European side, I hope that this event we'll see is a wake-up call for Europe, because talking with Iranians, they have the feeling that Europeans, say we want you to stay in the deal and we support the deal, but on the other hand, they don't do a lot because they think there is no alternative for Iran. And I think the Iranians are getting fed up with that. So at least, and I think that this European complacency, in the sense, saying that you don't have any choice, in fact, so go and suffer, if in a sense. And I think it's a dangerous policy, because I agree with what was said on the fact that the Iranian population is moderate, because it is a modern society, contrary to what we hear from the US government. It's a very modern society. We see it every day. And so they want to vote for the most moderate. On the other hand, when you see the economic situation today in Iran with inflation, what is becoming of a modern society when inflation rate reach 35, 40%? What would happen here when people don't have enough access to medicine? There was a very good, article on CNN on this time. People are just, let's say, are nearly dying now.
We'd have more than gilets jaunes on the street.
So I want to say that this European policy, in a sense, is dangerous, and nobody knows what could be the reaction in Iran due to this, social pressure due to the economic conditions.
Let me go back to Tehran. We're nearly out of time. Mohammad Marandi, let me just put that last point to you. European complacency, is this basically what's brought about this situation? Is it up to Europe? Is the onus on Europe to make the next move?
Absolutely. I agree with your guest in the studio. moderation in Iran can be defined in different ways. When Iranians feel that the other side is not abiding by his side of the bargain, then their definition of moderation means to take a firm stance, and therefore calls for Iran to exit the agreement so that Iran could have more cards in its hands to force the Americans to seriously negotiate. Those voices will get louder. And therefore, it's really up to the Europeans. The Iranians have abided by their side of the bargain. I don't think this is an Iranian issue. There will always be turf wars between the scope of the authority of the foreign ministry and other parts of the Iranian government, just as there in the United States and France and England and elsewhere.
All right.
But as long as the Europeans say one thing and do something else, and I think we're moving towards a more difficult situation.
All right, you've had the last word. Thank you very much indeed, Mohammad Marandi at the Tehran University. Thank you very much indeed to my other guests here in the studio, Thierry Coville, Research Fellow at the French Research Centre for International Strategic Studies. Thank you very much indeed to Tara Kangarlou in London. And last but not least, Ali Vaez at the Crisis Group. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. You've been watching the France 24 debate.